The ranch had always been marginal land, the kind of property that required constant negotiation between ambition and reality. 300 acres of red clay soil stretched across rolling hills where the grass turned brittle by midsummer and the creek beds ran dry 9 months out of 12. The topography was unforgiving, with slopes too steep for efficient grazing and bottomland too narrow for meaningful cultivation. The house sat on the highest point, a weathered 2-story frame structure, with a metal roof that pinged and drummed when the rare rain came. Behind it, a cluster of outbuildings leaned at angles that suggested slow surrender to gravity and time. The livestock operation was small by modern standards, 40 head of cattle, a dozen goats that served mostly as brush control, and chickens that scratched in the yard and nested in improbable places. It was enough to survive on barely, as long as nothing went catastrophically wrong. Jack had inherited the property from his father 5 years earlier, along with the mortgage, the maintenance backlog, and the unspoken expectation that he'd continue the family tradition of making something from nothing. He was 38 now, lean and sun-darkened, with the kind of quiet competence that came from fixing things alone and learning from failure. His hands were scarred from wire and tools, his face creased from squinting into sun and wind. His wife Laura ran the household and managed the small vegetable garden near the kitchen, coaxing tomatoes and beans from soil that seemed designed to resist cultivation. Their 2 teenagers, Ben and Sophie, split their time between school obligations and chores they performed with the minimum enthusiasm required to avoid lectures. Ben was 16, mechanically inclined, prone to long silences. Sophie was 14, sharp-tongued, already counting days until she could leave for college. Jack's mother still lived in the old guest cabin at the property line, a mile down the access road. She visited twice a week, always with opinions about how things should be done differently, always with stories about how Jack's father would have handled situations better. Every morning Jack walked the fence line before dawn, when the air was still cool and the light came low across the hills. It was a habit inherited from his father, this ritual of checking for breaks, watching the animals, reading the land for signs of change or trouble. On these walks, he'd developed a routine of stopping at the old concrete stock tank near the north pasture. The tank was a relic from the 1960s, a rectangular basin 8 feet long and 4 feet deep, fed by a spring that had slowed to a trickle over the decades. His grandfather had poured that concrete by hand, mixing batch after batch in a wheelbarrow, working through a summer weekend with 2 neighbors and a case of beer. Jack would run his fingers along the rough edge and study the water level, which never rose above 18 inches anymore. It was his anchor point, his benchmark, the place where he measured time and change. When the water was clear, the season was good. When it was cloudy with algae, he knew stress was coming. The signs started small, easy to dismiss as normal variation. The spring that fed the stock tank dried up completely in March, 2 months earlier than usual, leaving only a muddy depression where water used to pool. The creek that bisected the property stopped flowing in early April, the rocks in the stream bed whitening in the sun. The weather reports mentioned La Niña patterns and unseasonable high-pressure systems, but the language was vague and the forecasts changed daily, offering no clear guidance for action. Jack mentioned it at dinner one night in late April, suggesting they might face a serious dry spell that summer and should consider contingency plans. Laura reminded him that every summer was dry, that this was desert-adjacent country, and drought was the baseline condition. Ben said climate predictions were usually exaggerated by people with agendas. Sophie didn't look up from her phone, lost in conversations that had nothing to do with weather or water or the fragile economics of marginal ranching. His mother called it catastrophizing when he brought it up during her next visit. She'd lived through 5 decades on this land and seen plenty of droughts, some lasting years, and the ranch had always recovered, because that's what ranches did. Spending money on preparation when they were barely breaking even, when the operating account was already stretched thin and the equipment was aging faster than they could maintain it, seemed like panic rather than planning. Jack didn't argue. He knew from experience that arguing with his mother was like arguing with weather. He just stood at the kitchen window and watched the dust devils spin across the south pasture, where the grass should have been green but was already turning yellow. Before we go further, If you're watching from a place where water scarcity is real or where you've learned hard lessons about preparedness the expensive way, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if this kind of real-world survival engineering interests you, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when preparation meets the moment it was built for. Jack started running calculations in a spiral notebook he kept in the truck, the kind of detailed analysis that felt necessary even if nobody else understood why. The property had 3 water sources, each with different characteristics and vulnerabilities. The household well served the house and garden, 200 feet deep, drilled in the 1970s when the water table was higher and more stable. The livestock well in the east pasture was shallower, 90 feet, adequate for normal years but showing signs of stress when demand exceeded recharge, and rainwater from the roof, which had always just been allowed to run off into the gravel around the foundation, wasted potential that nobody had bothered to capture because water had always been available elsewhere. If both wells failed simultaneously, the nearest alternative was a municipal water station 11 miles away, accessible only by truck, practical only in short-term emergencies. At current cattle consumption rates, roughly 15 gallons per head per day during normal temperatures, more during heat stress, they'd need 600 gallons daily just for the animals, not counting household use or garden irrigation or the buffer needed for equipment cleaning and fire suppression. The roof of the house measured 40 feet by 60 feet, giving him 2,400 square feet of collection area. 1 inch of rain across that surface would yield roughly 1,500 gallons, a significant volume if it could be captured and stored. But rain wasn't coming. The long-range forecasts showed persistent high pressure and below-average precipitation probabilities extending through fall. The question wasn't how to catch rain that wasn't falling. The question was how to store enough water now while the wells still worked to survive an extended period when they might not. How to create a buffer between normal operations and catastrophic failure. How to buy time. He drove into town on a Wednesday afternoon and spent 2 hours at the farm supply store, pricing tanks and doing arithmetic on the back of a feed receipt. A 5,000-gallon polyethylene tank, the kind designed for above-ground installation, cost $1,800. They'd need at least 3 to create meaningful reserve capacity, assuming equal distribution and redundancy. That was $5,400 they didn't have, not with feed prices up 30% from the previous year, and cattle prices down 15%, and the credit cards already carrying balances they couldn't pay off. The bank wasn't going to extend their operating line for what Laura would correctly call disaster insurance that might never pay out. The numbers didn't work. The conventional solution was financially impossible. The idea came to him while he was fixing a fence post near the old stock tank, digging out rot and resetting cedar in concrete. The concrete his grandfather had mixed decades ago was still solid, still holding water despite hairline cracks and weathering and 50 years of freeze-thaw cycles. Concrete was cheap, bulk material priced by the yard rather than the finished product. Forms could be built from scrap lumber salvaged from demolished structures. Labor was free if he did it himself, if he could convince his family to help, if he could stomach the physical cost of weeks of manual work in heat that would only get worse. What he needed wasn't a tank, an off-the-shelf solution designed by engineers and marketed to people with budgets. What he needed was a wall, a barrier that could transform existing topography into functional storage. That evening he spread butcher paper across the kitchen table and sketched out the concept with a carpenter's pencil, working through the geometry while Laura watched with expressions that cycled through curiosity, skepticism, and concern. The natural contour of the land behind the barn created a shallow bowl, a depression that collected runoff during heavy rains and then slowly percolated into the ground. If he built a retaining wall across the low end of that bowl, 12 feet high and 60 feet long, the depression would become a reservoir, an engineered solution built from natural features. The wall would need to be 3 feet thick at the base for stability and load distribution, tapering to 18 inches at the top, to save material while maintaining structural integrity. He calculated volume using basic geometry. The basin could hold roughly 40,000 gallons at capacity, maybe more depending on how much sediment had accumulated over the years. It would take weeks to fill using the wells, running hoses overnight to transfer water from aquifer to surface storage, But once full, it would buy them months of reserve, months of buffer between normal operations and emergency decisions, months to wait for rain or aquifer recharge or some other solution that might materialize if they had time. Laura studied the sketch with the careful attention she gave to anything that would cost money or alter the property permanently. She asked what it would cost. He told her, $800 in concrete if he could negotiate bulk delivery, another $200 in rebar and hardware and miscellaneous fasteners, $50 for the rental of a cement mixer, because mixing 40 yards of concrete by hand would kill him. $1,050 total, maybe less if he could scavenge more materials. She asked what happened if the drought never came, if the seasonal patterns returned to normal, and the whole project turned out to be unnecessary preparation. He said they'd have a reservoir for future droughts, because drought was always coming eventually in country like this. She asked what happened if the wall leaked or collapsed, if his engineering was flawed, or the execution was inadequate, or the whole structure failed under the pressure of thousands of gallons of water. He said he'd engineer it not to fail, that he'd study the load calculations and follow the principles that made his grandfather's stock tank last 50 years. The conversation ended there, not with agreement but with an absence of further objection. Laura's version of consent that meant she wouldn't stop him but wouldn't endorse him either. His mother was less diplomatic when she heard about it 2 days later. She stopped by unannounced the way she always did and found Jack in the barn sketching wool cross-sections on a scrap of plywood. She called it a monument to anxiety, a concrete manifestation of fear rather than practical planning. The property had survived worse dry spells without resort to panic projects or amateur engineering, building a massive concrete wall with money they barely had on the theory that both wells might fail simultaneously in a scenario that had never happened in 50 years of family history, struck her as the kind of decision his father would have talked him out of over coffee and patience. Jack reminded her that his father had also poured the stock tank that still held water 50 years later, that sometimes preparation looked like overreaction until the moment it became survival. She said that was different. That was practical infrastructure with proven utility. This was apocalypse thinking, doomsday preparation, the mindset of people who built bunkers and hoarded supplies for disasters that never came. Ben thought it was overkill, but didn't mind the prospect of hard labor that would build muscle and provide something to talk about when school started. Sophie asked if she had to help, already negotiating for exemptions. Jack told them both they'd be digging foundation trenches whether they wanted to or not, that this was a family project, and family meant showing up even when you'd rather be somewhere else. The work would start the following Saturday at dawn, before the heat became dangerous, and continue until it was done or until they physically couldn't continue. He spent the rest of the week gathering materials with the intensity of someone who knew that hesitation meant abandonment. The lumber came from a demolished barn 2 properties over, a structure that had finally collapsed under its own neglect. The owner was happy to let Jack haul away the usable wood for free, saving disposal costs. The rebar he bought at cost from a contractor he'd helped during harvest the previous year, calling in a favor that had been stored like currency. The concrete would be delivered in bulk, 2,400 pounds at a time in mixer trucks that would dump directly into his forms if he could coordinate timing and preparation. He laid out the site with stakes and string, checking the grade with a level, ensuring the foundation would be true and the wall would rise plumb. The foundation trench would need to be 4 feet deep, below the frost line even though freezing was rare, wide enough to distribute the load across soil that was more clay than anything else. The excavation alone would be 2 days of work, maybe 3, depending on how many rocks they hit and how compacted the clay was beneath the topsoil. The digging started before dawn on Saturday, the sky still dark, the air cool enough to make work possible. Jack ran the compact excavator he'd borrowed from a neighbor, a machine older than his marriage, but still functional if you understood its quirks. He cut the trench in passes, pulling out clay in chunks that broke apart when they hit the spoil pile. Ben and Sophie cleared the loose material with shovels, a job that was mindless and exhausting and oddly meditative. Laura brought water every hour, monitoring for signs of heat exhaustion or dehydration, enforcing breaks that Jack resisted but needed. By noon, they'd completed 20 feet of trench, the walls vertical and the bottom relatively level. By evening, they'd finished 40 feet, past the halfway point, committed to completion by the sheer volume of work already invested. The work was repetitive, physically exhausting, satisfyingly measurable in ways that ranch work often wasn't. At the end of the day, Jack stood at the edge of the excavation and studied the raw earth walls, the exposure of soil layers that told the history of the land. This was real. This was happening. They'd crossed the threshold from idea to implementation. Sunday they poured the footer, the foundation that would carry the weight of the wall and the water behind it. Jack mixed concrete in 100-pound batches, a rhythm of aggregate and Portland cement and water that he'd learned from his father. He fed the mixer constantly, keeping it running, while Ben and Sophie manned wheelbarrows and ran loads to the trench where Laura helped spread and level the mix with a rake and a 2x4 screed. The process required rhythm and constant motion and coordination. If the concrete set in the mixer, it became dead weight. If it set in the wheelbarrows, they'd need to chip it out with hammers. If they didn't level it properly, the entire wall would be out of plumb. They worked through the afternoon heat, through fatigue that made simple tasks difficult, through Laura's quiet observations that maybe they should have hired someone who actually knew what they were doing instead of learning through trial and error. By dusk, the footer was complete, a solid foundation ribbon 60 feet long and 4 feet deep, rough but functional, adequate to the task. They let it cure for 3 days, sprinkling water on it twice daily to slow the curing process and prevent cracking. Jack spent that time building forms for the wall itself, constructing interlocking panels from the reclaimed barn lumber. The design was simple but required precision. 2 parallel form walls held together by cross braces every 4 feet, creating a cavity 3 feet wide at the base. He'd pour in layers, letting each section cure before stacking the next, building height incrementally rather than attempting the full 12 feet in a single dangerous pour. The rebar went in first, a grid of vertical and horizontal steel that would give the concrete tensile strength it lacked naturally. The physics were straightforward, something he'd looked up in a construction manual at the library. Concrete resisted compression but failed under tension. Steel did the opposite. Together they created a composite material stronger than either alone, the principle behind every bridge and building and dam. The first pour went up 4 feet, a volume of concrete that required 8 hours of continuous mixing and wheelbarrow runs and spreading and tamping. Jack mixed and Ben wheeled and Sophie tamped the concrete down into the forms, working out air pockets with a length of rebar used as a poker. Laura checked the level constantly, adjusting cross braces to prevent bowing or shifting, calling out when sections needed more material or attention. The concrete was stiff, dense, unforgiving of error. When they stripped the forms 2 days later after the initial cure, the surface was rough but solid, showing the grain of the wood and the texture of handwork and amateur craftsmanship. It looked ancient and new at the same time, like something built from principles that predated modern convenience. His mother visited during the second pour and stood at a distance watching them work, arms crossed in the posture she used when observing mistakes in progress. When they broke for water and shade, she asked Jack if he understood that he was turning the property into a construction site for a project that might never be necessary, that might never prove its value, that might just stand there for decades as a reminder of overreaction. He asked if she remembered the Dust Bowl, the photographs of failed farms and families fleeing west with everything they owned in trucks. She said that was a different era, a different set of circumstances, a catastrophe that belonged to history rather than present-day risk assessment. He pointed out that droughts didn't respect eras or historical categories. They respected preparation and planning and the presence of water when it was needed. She left without saying goodbye, disapproval radiating from her silence. The wall rose in stages, each pour building on the previous one, each section requiring adjustment and recalibration and problem-solving. 4 feet, then 8, then 10, the structure growing more imposing with each addition. Each pour required mixing 30 bags of concrete, 600 pounds of material transformed from powder and aggregate into permanent structure. The mixer broke down during the 5th pour, the drive belt shredding under load, and Jack spent 2 hours rebuilding it from spare parts scavenged from old equipment in the barn. A windstorm knocked over a section of forms one night, and they lost an afternoon resetting everything, checking alignment, reinforcing the bracing. Sophie sprained her wrist moving a loaded wheelbarrow and had to sit out a full day, leaving the remaining 3 to pick up her share of the work. The project became a presence in their lives that defined days and structured conversations. Meals were scheduled around pause and cure times. Sleep was dictated by what needed to happen the next morning. The wall was always there, either as work in progress or as future work they needed to prepare for. At 12 feet, the wall was complete, massive and monolithic, utterly incongruous with the ramshackle buildings around it. Jack built a simple spillway at one end, using sections of culvert pipe, preventing overflow damage if the reservoir ever filled beyond capacity. He installed a valve at the base for controlled drainage, a brass gate valve that could release water gradually or shut off flow completely. The structure was imposing, permanent, designed to outlast everyone who built it. Standing at its base, you felt the weight of intention made concrete, the translation of abstract fear into physical defense. Laura said it looked like something from a different century, like frontier engineering built by people who had no choice but to solve their own problems. Ben said it looked like someone expected the apocalypse and wanted a monument to preparation. Sophie took pictures for her social media and called it dystopian aesthetic, whatever that meant. Jack spent a week sealing the interior surface with waterproof coating, working from a scaffold built from lumber and rope. The coating was thick, industrial, designed for cisterns and water treatment facilities. It smelled like chemicals and petroleum and required a respirator and ventilation. He worked in the early morning before the heat made the fumes unbearable. When the sealing was done, he tested the wall by running a hose into the basin and monitoring for leaks over 72 hours. Water pooled at the bottom, clear and still, reflecting clouds and sky. No obvious seepage appeared in the first day. By the third day, the level had dropped 2 inches, an acceptable loss to evaporation given the surface area and summer heat. The concrete was porous, but the coating held. The wall worked. Now came the slow part, the patient accumulation of reserve that would either prove necessary or sit unused for years. Filling the reservoir required time and strategic use of well capacity without compromising daily operations. Jack ran 2 hoses overnight every night, pulling from the livestock well that still showed adequate flow. 10 gallons per minute from each hose translated to 1,200 gallons over a 10-hour nighttime run. At that rate, it would take a month to fill 40,000 gallons, assuming the well could sustain that draw without depleting faster than recharge. He explained the timeline to Laura, and she asked what they were supposed to do if the livestock well ran dry, while they were filling a reservoir that might never be needed. He said they'd cross that bridge when they came to it. She said that wasn't a plan, that was hope disguised as strategy. He said it was the only plan that made sense given their constraints and resources. The well didn't run dry during the filling. The water level in the reservoir rose 6 inches the first week, a visible increase that made the project feel real. 14 inches the second week, as he optimized the hose placement and flow rates. Jack checked it every morning during his fence walk, the way he used to check the old stock tank, treating it as a new benchmark for measuring time and preparation. The water was murky at first, picking up sediment from the concrete and dissolved minerals from the coating, but it cleared as the materials cured fully and particles settled. By the end of the third week, they had 12 feet of depth, a volume that already represented meaningful reserve. By the end of the fourth week, the reservoir was at capacity. 40,000 gallons of water sitting behind a wall his family had doubted he needed to build, insurance against a disaster they hoped wouldn't come. The drought came on suddenly after a deceptively normal spring. What had been a dry season with scattered rain became a catastrophic summer with no precipitation at all. The long-range forecasts, which had been vaguely concerning in April and May, changed from optimistic to alarming within a 2-week span in June. Meteorologists started using terms like historic and unprecedented and worst-case scenario. The high-pressure system that had settled over the region showed no signs of weakening or moving. Rainfall totals dropped to 0 and stayed there week after week. Humidity stayed in the teens, desiccating everything exposed to air. Every morning dawned clear and hot, temperature climbing past 90 by 9 o'clock, past 100 by noon. The evenings brought no relief, no cooling, no moisture. The land baked. The household well held steady initially, its depth protecting it from short-term fluctuations. But the livestock well began to show stress in early July, a decline in flow rate that Jack documented with pressure gauge readings twice daily. The water table was dropping, the aquifer depleting faster than seasonal recharge could replenish. The pump was cycling more frequently to maintain pressure, the motor running hot, the system working harder for diminishing output. By mid-July, the well was producing at 60% capacity, enough to meet demand but with no margin for error. By the end of July, it was at 40% and declining visibly. The cattle were stressed, grouping near the troughs constantly, bawling when the water ran low, fighting for access. Jack started supplementing from the reservoir, running a 3/4-inch hose from the drainage valve to the east pasture troughs, a quarter-mile run that required careful placement to avoid kinking. The cattle didn't care where the water came from. They just drank. Laura stopped questioning the wall. The practical utility was obvious now, immediate, measurable in gallons consumed and livestock kept alive. Ben helped run hoses without complaint, understanding that his summer had become about water rather than recreation. Sophie monitored trough levels twice daily and reported shortfalls so they could adjust flow. His mother visited less frequently, the drive becoming harder in heat that was dangerous for elderly people, and didn't mention the reservoir when she did come. The project had shifted in status from eccentricity to necessity, without anyone formally acknowledging the transition or admitting they'd been wrong. The livestock well failed on August 9th at 2 in the afternoon. Jack was in the barn repairing a gate latch when the pressure dropped to 0. He could hear the pump running, but nothing was coming through the lines. He shut down the system immediately and spent the next 2 hours pulling the pump, hauling sections of pipe up from 90 feet of depth, the work brutal in heat that made metal too hot to touch bare-handed. When the pump finally reached the surface, it was caked in fine silt, the intake screen completely blocked. The well hadn't gone dry in the absolute sense. The aquifer had dropped below the intake depth, leaving the pump pulling silt and air instead of water. He cleaned the pump methodically and stored it in the barn, knowing it was useless unless the aquifer recharged significantly. Then he walked to the reservoir and calculated what they had left. The water level was down 5 feet from capacity due to weeks of supplemental use. That left roughly 25,000 gallons. 40 head of cattle at 15 gallons per day meant 600 gallons daily consumption under normal temperatures, more during heat stress. At current consumption rates, they had 41 days of supply remaining, maybe 35 if temperatures stayed extreme. 41 days to wait for rain, or aquifer recovery, or some other solution that might not materialize. 41 days before they had to make decisions that would define the future of the property. Laura asked what happened after 41 days, what the plan was for day 42 when the reservoir was empty and the wells were still dry. Jack said honestly that he didn't know, that he was focused on managing the days they had rather than planning for scenarios that might not occur. Ben asked if they should sell the cattle immediately before the situation deteriorated further, before every other rancher in the region tried to sell simultaneously and crashed the market. Jack said they'd lose catastrophic money selling into a drought market when buyers knew sellers were desperate. Holding the cattle gave them a chance for recovery if rain came. Sophie asked what happened to farms that ran out of water completely, whether they were abandoned or foreclosed or what. Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to articulate the obvious conclusion. The household well was still producing adequately, but Jack imposed strict rationing anyway, conserving every possible gallon for livestock use. Showers were limited to 3 minutes, timed and enforced. Laundry ran once a week. The garden was allowed to die. The plants withering in the sun while available water was redirected to animals that represented their income and future. Laura protested once, pointing out that they were human beings who needed water for basic dignity and sanitation. Jack agreed but said the cattle represented everything they owned and their ability to continue living here. If the animals died, they lost the property. If they lost the property, dignity became irrelevant. She didn't argue further. The heat intensified through August in ways that made July seem moderate by comparison. The temperature stayed above 100 degrees for 15 consecutive days, overnight lows only dropping to 85. The grass in the pastures turned to dust and blew away in the wind. The topsoil cracked into polygonal plates separated by deep fissures that reached 6 inches down. The cattle lost weight despite supplemental hay, their coats looking rough and dull, their eyes sunken. Jack checked them twice daily, walking among them, looking for signs of heat stress or dehydration or the behavioral changes that preceded death. One of the older cows, a good producer with 5 calves to her credit, went down in mid-August and couldn't get back up despite their efforts to assist her. Jack had to put her down with a rifle shot, ending her suffering. They lost 300 pounds of beef and 1 breeding animal in a single afternoon, a financial hit they couldn't afford. The reservoir level dropped visibly day by day. Jack marked the concrete wall with chalk every morning, tracking the rate of decline, watching the waterline recede. 3 inches per day initially, 4 inches per day as temperatures climbed. The math was relentless and unforgiving. They were consuming faster than the original estimates because the heat was driving animal water requirements up by 20%. 35 days of supply became 30 days, became 25 days. Laura stopped asking questions about plans and contingencies, focusing instead on managing what was directly in front of them. Ben started looking at job listings in town, preparing for a future that didn't include the ranch. Sophie spent more time at friends' houses, where the conversation wasn't dominated by water consumption and survival calculations and whether they'd make it through September. His mother came by in late August and walked to the reservoir's edge unannounced. The water level was down 10 feet from capacity, the waterline marked by mineral staining on the exposed concrete. Above the waterline, the surface was white and chalky. Below the waterline, the water was dark and still, holding heat from the sun. She stood there a long time looking at what remained, doing her own calculations. Then she asked Jack what would have happened if he hadn't built the wall, if he'd listened to her advice and avoided this entire project. He said they would have lost the entire herd when the livestock well failed in early August, that they'd have been forced to sell at catastrophic prices or haul water at costs that exceeded the value of the animals. She asked how he'd known to build it, what had convinced him the risk was real when everyone else thought it was theoretical. He said he hadn't known anything for certain. He'd just understood that the cost of not building it was potentially catastrophic, while the cost of building it wrong was just money and effort. She didn't say she'd been wrong, but her silence was a kind of admission. September came with no relief, no change in the weather patterns that were destroying farms throughout the region. The household well began to show stress finally, the water table dropping to levels that affected even the deeper wells. The flow rate decreased and the water took on a mineral taste, concentrated by evaporation and reduced recharge. Jack tested it with a water quality kit he'd ordered online and found elevated levels of dissolved solids, not dangerous but unpleasant. The aquifer wasn't dry, but it was being concentrated, the water that remained carrying higher mineral loads. They started boiling all drinking water, and the house smelled constantly of minerals and heat and the subtle desperation of rationing. The herd was down to 28 head by mid-September. Jack had sold 8 animals in an emergency auction that brought 30 cents on the dollar, buyers knowing that sellers were desperate and had no negotiating position. The remaining animals were lean and skittish, their behavior altered by sustained stress and reduced nutrition. Jack moved them to the north pasture, where a line of cottonwood trees still provided some shade during the hottest part of the day. He ran the reservoir hose a quarter-mile to the new location, an absurd logistics challenge that required constant monitoring for kinks and breaks. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was doing nothing and watching them die. The reservoir hit critical level on September 20th, 8 feet of depth remaining, roughly 12,000 gallons, 18 days of supply at current consumption rates, maybe 20 if he could further reduce usage somehow. Jack called a family meeting that evening and laid out the options with brutal honesty. They could sell the rest of the herd immediately and take the financial loss, accepting defeat, but preserving some capital. They could wait and hope for rain or groundwater recovery, gambling that natural processes would intervene before they ran completely dry. They could haul water from the municipal station 11 miles away, which would cost more per day than the animals were worth, and require constant trips in heat that was dangerous for people and trucks. Laura voted to sell and cut their losses. Ben voted to wait, believing that giving up guaranteed failure while waiting at least offered a chance. Sophie abstained, saying she didn't understand enough about ranch economics to have an informed opinion. Jack said he needed 48 hours to think, to run more calculations, to see if there was an option they hadn't considered. That night he walked out to the old stock tank, the place that had been his anchor point before the reservoir existed. It had been dry for 4 months, the bottom covered in dust and blown leaves and the desiccated remains of grass. He sat on the concrete edge where he used to measure water levels and tried to think through the decision tree rationally. Every option ended in loss. The only question was which loss was manageable and which was catastrophic. He sat there through the night, watching stars and thinking about his grandfather who had poured this concrete and his father who had maintained it and the chain of decisions that had led to this moment. The rain started on September 23rd at 4 in the morning. It came without warning, without the usual atmospheric signals of dropping pressure and increasing wind. The sky simply opened and water fell. It was light at first, barely enough to wet the ground, individual drops that left dark circles on the dust. Then it increased, becoming steady, soaking, relentless. Jack woke to the sound on the metal roof and thought he was dreaming. He went outside and stood in the yard feeling it hit his face and hands and knowing this was real. Laura came out and stood next to him in her nightgown, both of them getting soaked. Ben and Sophie watched from the porch in silence. His mother called on the phone from the cabin and asked if he was seeing what she was seeing, if this was actually happening. The rain lasted 16 hours. By the end of the first hour, the dust had turned to mud. By the end of the 4th hour, the creek beds were running with brown water. By the end of the 8th hour, the reservoir was rising, fed by runoff from the surrounding hills and the natural drainage that had been dry for months. Jack checked it at midnight with a flashlight, watching the waterline climb. It was up 3 feet from critical level. By morning, it was up 7 feet. By the time the rain stopped in the evening, the reservoir was back at capacity, water flowing over the spillway he'd built, the sound of overflow like vindication. But the rain itself wasn't the turning point. It helped, but it didn't solve everything. The livestock well was still dry. The household well was still stressed. The real question was whether the aquifer would recharge fast enough to restore well function before the reservoir became critical again. That was the test. Jack waited 3 days for soil saturation and then pulled the pump from the livestock well again, a repeat of the process from August, but with different intent. This time he extended the intake pipe another 15 feet, using sections he'd kept in reserve, reaching deeper into the aquifer where water might have accumulated. The modification took 6 hours of careful work in September heat that was still brutal. When he dropped the pump back down 90 feet and fired it up, standing next to the wellhead listening to the motor, the pressure gauge climbed slowly and then held steady at 40 psi. Water flowed clear and strong, the aquifer recharged by rainfall that had infiltrated through fractured soil and porous rock. The well was alive again, functional, producing. He tested it for 24 hours, monitoring flow rate and pressure consistency. The numbers held steady. The well was producing at 90% of its original capacity, enough to sustain operations without reservoir backup. He shut off the reservoir supply and switched the cattle back to well water exclusively. The reservoir level held at capacity, untouched, a reserve that had been tested and proven necessary and was now ready for the next emergency. Laura stood at the wall 3 days after the rain and did the math out loud, articulating what everyone was thinking. If he hadn't built the reservoir, the livestock well failure in August would have forced them to sell or haul water. Selling would have meant financial catastrophe in a market flooded with desperate ranchers. Hauling would have cost more than the animals were worth. The reservoir had bought them exactly the time they needed to reach the rain. The rain had recharged the aquifer. The sequence was narrow but sufficient. They'd survived by the margin that preparation had created. Ben said they'd gotten lucky, that the rain could have come a week later and found them empty. Jack said luck was what happened when preparation met opportunity at the exact right moment. Sophie asked what would have happened if the rain hadn't come at all, if September had ended dry and October had started dry and they'd run completely out. Jack said they'd have found out what the next plan was, that survival was a series of decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information. His mother said quietly that she'd been wrong to call it catastrophizing, that sometimes catastrophe was just what happened when you ignored credible signs and refused to prepare. The cattle recovered over the following month as fall rains continued sporadically and temperatures finally dropped below 90. Their coats came back glossy and healthy. Their weight returned to normal ranges. The pasture grass regrew in patches that spread and merged, green returning to hills that had been brown and dead. The household well stabilized and the mineral taste faded as the aquifer diluted back to normal concentrations. Life returned to something resembling the baseline normal they'd known before the drought, but normal was different now. Everyone understood what it felt like to count down to zero and survive only because someone had prepared when preparation looked unnecessary. Jack kept the reservoir full, running hoses overnight periodically to top it off after evaporation losses. He tested the wall monthly for cracks or seepage or any sign of structural degradation. None appeared. The concrete had cured into a monolith, engineered not through formal expertise, but through attention to principles and willingness to learn. The structure would last decades, probably longer than the house or the outbuildings. It would be there for the next drought and the drought after that, and all the future emergencies that would eventually come, because emergencies always came to marginal land operated on narrow margins. In November, the regional feed prices dropped and cattle prices recovered to profitable levels. The drought had reduced supply enough to increase demand. Jack sold 10 head at a profit and used the money to pay down accumulated debt from the summer. He kept 18 as breeding stock for rebuilding the herd. The operation was smaller now, but more resilient, rebuilt on the understanding that survival required buffers and preparation and willingness to act on incomplete information. On Thanksgiving morning, Jack walked out to the old stock tank. It was full again for the first time since March, fed by the runoff that was still working its way through the watershed and recharging the shallow aquifers. The water was clear and cold, reflecting sky and clouds. He sat on the concrete edge where he used to measure time and thought about continuity and preparation and the things that lasted. His grandfather had poured this concrete by hand in the 1960s. His father had maintained it through decades of weather. Now he'd built something similar, something that would outlast him and serve people he'd never meet, decisions he'd never witness. Laura found him there an hour later, walking up quietly. She asked if he was okay. He said he was just thinking about what they'd learned, what the drought had taught them beyond the immediate survival lessons. She said she'd learned that doubt was cheap and consequences were expensive, that being wrong about preparation cost nothing, while being unprepared could cost everything. He said he'd learned that being right wasn't really the point. The point was being ready regardless of whether you turned out to be right, because readiness was the only thing you could control. The drought broke officially in December when the Weather Service declared normal precipitation patterns restored. The regional drought index returned to normal, the aquifer levels stabilized, and began the slow process of recovering fully. But the psychological impact lasted longer than the weather patterns. Everyone who'd lived through it understood something new about vulnerability and preparation and the value of actions taken before crisis arrived. Jack still walked the fence line every morning. He still checked water levels throughout the property. He still maintained the reservoir and monitored the wells and paid attention to weather forecasts with the heightened awareness of someone who'd learned that patterns could break and normalcy could collapse. The wall stood behind the barn, holding 40,000 gallons, a monument not to fear but to the understanding that readiness and luck were two different things that occasionally intersected at exactly the moment you needed both. His family no longer doubted him when he suggested preparing for unlikely events or building infrastructure for emergencies that seemed distant. They'd learned firsthand the cost of waiting until certainty, of assuming that historical patterns would continue indefinitely. They'd learned that worst-case scenarios weren't theoretical when you'd lived through the narrow margin between disaster and survival, when you'd counted down the days and survived only because someone had ignored doubt and built something anyway. The ranch continued into winter and the seasons that followed. The challenges remained because land was always challenging, and marginal operations always operated at the edge of viability. But they faced those challenges with different assumptions now, with infrastructure they'd built in advance, and understanding they'd earned through stress. The wall had taught them something beyond practical water storage. It had taught them that preparation wasn't paranoia, and that concrete poured in advance of necessity could be the difference between collapse and continuity. And on certain mornings, when Jack walked past the reservoir after checking the cattle, he'd stop and run his hand along the rough concrete surface. He'd feel the aggregate and the embedded rebar and the permanence of intention made physical. He'd think about his grandfather's stock tank and his father's fence lines and all the accumulated small preparations that added up to survival over generations. The wall wasn't the end of anything. It was just another line of defense in a long series of defenses that made the difference between losing everything and holding on long enough to see what happened next, between accepting defeat and creating margin for recovery. The future would bring more droughts. The climate patterns were shifting in ways that made historical data less reliable and long-term predictions more uncertain. But the reservoir would be there, filled and maintained and ready. A 40,000-gallon buffer against the next time the wells went dry and the sky refused to release water. That was the essential lesson. Not that disaster could be avoided through preparation, but that its impact could be managed by people willing to build solid infrastructure before the moment of need arrived, before certainty replaced doubt, before the cost of being wrong exceeded the cost of being ready. Jack didn't tell the story often to people outside the family. When neighbors asked about the wall, he explained the engineering briefly and moved on to other topics. The point wasn't to prove anything to anyone or claim vindication. The point was to be ready for conditions that would eventually return. And on the ranch, in the red clay hills where water was always the limiting factor and margins were always narrow, being ready was the difference between persistence and collapse, between continuing and abandoning everything his family had built over 3 generations. His family had doubted him. The wall had proven them wrong through concrete, measurable outcomes. The drought had made the proof undeniable. But the real victory wasn't vindication or being right. It was survival. It was still being there to face the next challenge, whatever form it took, with infrastructure in place and lessons learned. The wall would be there too, solid and silent and functional, holding water against the inevitable return of scarcity. That was enough. Winter brought normalcy that felt strange after the intensity of summer. The rains came regularly, not in dramatic downpours, but in the steady precipitation that rebuilt soil moisture and recharged aquifers gradually. The cattle filled out on winter grass that grew thick in the pastures. Jack rebuilt the herd slowly, buying young stock when prices were favorable, focusing on genetics that favored heat tolerance and efficient water use. The operation adapted, becoming slightly different than it had been, shaped by the lessons of the drought. Laura planted the garden again in early spring, choosing drought-resistant varieties and installing drip irrigation fed from the household well. She'd learned that total loss was preventable with planning, that giving up on everything at once was a choice rather than an inevitability. The garden produced through the summer tomatoes and squash and beans, a supplement to their food supply that reduced grocery costs and provided something normal in a year that had felt anything but normal. Ben graduated high school that spring and surprised everyone by choosing to stay on the ranch rather than pursuing the college plans he'd been developing. He said the drought had taught him something about the value of self-reliance and physical work, that maybe there was more to learn here than in classrooms. He took over maintenance of the water systems, checking the wells daily, monitoring the reservoir, maintaining the pumps and hoses. He treated it like an apprenticeship in practical survival, learning from his father's knowledge and adding his own observations. Sophie still talked about leaving, but with less urgency. She'd seen what it meant to face real problems rather than abstract concerns, to work through crisis with family rather than alone. The experience had shifted something in her understanding of what mattered. She still spent time with friends and on her phone, still complained about chores, but she showed up when needed and paid attention to the water systems in ways she hadn't before the drought. The change was subtle but real. Jack's mother visited more regularly as winter progressed into spring. She didn't apologize directly for her earlier doubts, but she asked questions about the reservoir design and maintenance, about his planning process and decision-making. She was studying it, trying to understand the thinking that had led him to prepare when preparation looked unnecessary. One afternoon in March, she stood at the reservoir with him and said quietly that his father would have been proud, that the willingness to act on incomplete information and take responsibility for outcomes was what made ranching possible across generations. It was the closest she'd come to admitting she'd been wrong. The reservoir became part of the property's infrastructure, as normal as the wells or the barn. Jack maintained it with the same attention he gave to fence lines and equipment. He drained it once that first year after the drought, in November when temperatures were mild, to inspect the concrete for cracks or structural issues. The wall was perfect. The coating had cured completely and showed no degradation. The concrete itself was solid, showing the same durability his grandfather's stock tank had demonstrated over 50 years. He refilled it slowly over 2 weeks and let it sit at capacity, ready. Other ranchers in the region started asking about the design. Word spread through the informal networks that connected rural properties, conversations at feed stores and equipment auctions, and community events. Jack shared the plans freely, sketching dimensions and explaining load calculations and concrete mixture ratios. 3 neighbors built similar structures the following year, 2 more the year after that. The idea propagated because it worked, because it was affordable, because it solved a problem that everyone understood after living through the drought. The livestock well stabilized at full production and stayed reliable through the following years. Jack monitored it carefully, logging flow rates and pressure readings, watching for any sign of decline that might signal another aquifer drop. The household well remained strong, its 200-foot depth protecting it from all but the most severe droughts. But he never took them for granted, never assumed that water would always be available just because it had been in the past. The drought had taught him that assumptions were dangerous and monitoring was essential. He started keeping more detailed weather records, not just rainfall totals but temperature patterns and humidity trends and wind data. He compared his observations to historical averages and regional forecasts, looking for patterns that might signal risk. It became another morning ritual, checking gauges and recording data, building a personal archive of environmental information. Laura thought it was excessive at first, but came to understand it as insurance, the same category as the reservoir itself. The cattle operation stabilized financially. The herd rebuilt to 30 head, smaller than the pre-drought peak, but more manageable with available water and grazing. Jack focused on quality over quantity, selecting breeding stock that produced efficiently in harsh conditions. The market prices improved as regional supply tightened from drought losses throughout the area. They had good years and marginal years, but never another catastrophic year like the drought summer. Ben took on more responsibility as he learned the operation. He was 20 now, still living on the property, talking about buying the neighbor's 40 acres when the old man retired. He'd developed his own relationship with the land, understanding it differently than Jack did, but with the same underlying respect for limits and preparation. He maintained the reservoir as carefully as Jack had built it, treating it as critical infrastructure rather than optional convenience. Sophie left for college eventually, but came back during summers and breaks. The experience of the drought had given her stories that resonated with her friends, a kind of authenticity that suburban kids found compelling. She talked about the reservoir and the countdown to zero and what it felt like to face real consequence. Jack listened to her descriptions and recognized that she'd learned something he couldn't have taught directly, something that only experience could convey. The second significant dry spell came 3 years after the first. It wasn't as severe, only 8 weeks without rain rather than 5 months, but it was enough to stress the livestock well and drop the aquifer noticeably. Jack supplemented from the reservoir immediately, without hesitation or debate. The family understood the protocol now. When the well showed stress, they shifted to reserve. When reserve dropped below 20 feet, they reduced consumption. When recovery indicators appeared, they returned to normal operations. It was a playbook written through experience and proven through repetition. That second drought ended with normal seasonal rains and minimal drama. They hadn't approached emergency conditions because the infrastructure was in place, and the response was immediate. The reservoir had done exactly what it was designed to do, buffering against short-term supply interruption without requiring crisis-level intervention. Laura pointed out that this was the real test, not the first drought, but the second one, the one where preparation became routine rather than emergency response. Jack agreed. The wall had become invisible infrastructure, valuable precisely because it worked without attention. Jack was 43 now, greying at the temples, carrying the cumulative wear of ranch work in his joints and hands. He still walked the fence line every morning, still checked the water systems, still treated the land as something that required constant attention and respect. The property looked different than it had 5 years earlier. The buildings were better maintained. The pastures were managed more carefully. The water infrastructure was comprehensive and redundant. It was still marginal land, but the margins had improved through intentional preparation and hard-won understanding. His mother was 78 and slowing down, visiting less frequently as the drive became harder. She spent more time in the cabin, reading and watching the hills change through seasons. She'd stopped offering unsolicited advice years ago, shifting into a role that was more observer than critic. When she did visit the main house, she'd walk out to the reservoir and stand there looking at the water, a ritual that meant something Jack didn't fully understand but respected. Maybe she was thinking about her own doubts and how they'd been resolved. Maybe she was just appreciating the view. The reservoir held 40,000 gallons through all seasons and conditions. It was there in spring, when the wells ran strong and reserves seemed unnecessary. It was there in summer when temperatures climbed and evaporation increased and consumption rose. It was there in fall when rains came and the threat receded. It was there in winter when demand dropped and nature rebuilt what summer had depleted. Its presence was constant, its value measured not in daily use but in availability during crisis. Jack taught Ben to maintain the concrete, how to check for cracks, how to patch and seal if necessary, how to monitor structural integrity over time. He explained the physics of water pressure and load distribution, the reason the wall was tapered, the purpose of the rebar grid, the function of the spillway. Ben absorbed it all with the intensity of someone learning skills he knew he'd need. The knowledge would transfer across another generation, preparation becoming tradition, tradition becoming survival. The ranch continued, as ranches do, through cycles of challenge and recovery. Some years were good with adequate rain and favorable prices. Some years were hard with drought or market collapse or equipment failure, but they persisted because they'd built infrastructure that created margin between normal operations and catastrophic failure. The wall was part of that margin, along with the maintained fences and serviced equipment and diversified income streams and accumulated knowledge. Jack stood at the reservoir on the 5th anniversary of completing it, early morning in late September, the air cool and promising fall. The water was calm and reflective, holding mirror images of clouds. He could see the waterline marked on the concrete, the stains showing where it had been during the crisis and where it had recovered to afterward. Those marks were a record, a testament, proof that the preparation had mattered when it was tested. He thought about the sequence of decisions that had led here, the choice to build when his family doubted, the choice to commit resources they barely had, the choice to complete the work despite resistance and skepticism, the choice to fill it slowly when faster would have been riskier, the choice to use it immediately when the livestock well failed. Each decision had been a branch point where other choices would have led to other outcomes. This outcome, standing here with a functional ranch and a reservoir that had proven its value, felt earned rather than lucky. Laura joined him, bringing coffee and metal camp mugs. They stood together, looking at the water without talking. After a while, she said it was strange to think that 5 years ago this didn't exist, that the depression behind the barn had just been a low spot where runoff pooled and nothing grew well. Jack said the land had always had that potential. He'd just recognized it and made it functional. She said that was what preparation was, recognizing potential problems and potential solutions and connecting them before crisis forced improvisation. The sun came up over the eastern hills, light spreading across the property. The cattle were moving toward the troughs in the east pasture, their morning routine as predictable as weather patterns. The chickens were active in the yard, scratching and pecking. Smoke was rising from his mother's cabin chimney. Everything was normal, which meant everything was working, which meant the preparation had created space for normalcy to persist, despite the underlying precariousness of their situation. Ben came out of the barn carrying tools, headed to repair a section of fence in the south pasture. He waved at his parents standing by the reservoir. Sophie was still asleep in the house, home for a long weekend from college, enjoying the luxury of late mornings that ranch work didn't usually permit. The family was intact, functioning, adapted to conditions that had tested them, and finding equilibrium on the other side of stress. Jack finished his coffee and handed the empty mug to Laura. He had work to do, fence lines to check, equipment to maintain, decisions to make about the winter feeding program. The work never stopped because the land never stopped presenting challenges, but he faced those challenges with infrastructure that worked and knowledge that was tested and family that understood why preparation mattered. The reservoir was part of that foundation, concrete and water and engineering serving a purpose that went beyond the immediate function of storing liquid. The sky was clear, high pressure settling in for what looked like a beautiful fall day. The forecast predicted no rain for 2 weeks, but temperatures were moderate and demand was low. The wells were producing adequately. The reservoir was full. They had margin and buffer and time to work and plan and prepare for whatever came next, because something always came next, and readiness was the only reliable defense against surprise. Jack walked back toward the barn, his morning routine continuing, the cycle of maintenance and monitoring and management that defined his days. The reservoir remained behind him, silent and functional, holding 40,000 gallons of security against an uncertain future. It would be there tomorrow and next month and next year and for decades after he was gone. It would serve his children and possibly his grandchildren, infrastructure outlasting the person who built it, because that's what good infrastructure did. The wall had been doubted. The crisis had proven it necessary. The years since had confirmed its value. That was the full arc of preparation, from skepticism through vindication to integration into normal operations. And through it all, the concrete stood solid, the water stayed contained, and the margin between disaster and survival remained measurable in gallons and days, and the distance between empty and full, that distance was everything. It was the space where life continued, where ranching persisted, where family held together through stress that might otherwise have fractured them. The wall had created that space. Jack had built it. His family had doubted him. The drought had proven him right, and now they all lived in the security that preparation had purchased, understanding that the price of readiness was always cheaper than the cost of being unprepared when crisis arrived, without warning or mercy or second chances. The ranch endured. The wall stood. The water waited. And Jack walked his fence lines every morning, checking for breaks, watching the animals, reading the land for signs of what might come next, always ready because readiness was the only way to survive on marginal land, with narrow margins and consequences that arrived faster than solutions if you waited too long to prepare.